The first rays of sunlight painted the Arizona Territory sky in shades of crimson and gold as Samuel Morrison stepped onto the wooden porch of his modest ranch house. The year was 1867, and the morning air carried the familiar scent of sagebrush and distant wood smoke. Samuel stretched his weathered arms above his head, his joints protesting after another restless night. At 42 years old, the former Union cavalry officer had grown accustomed to solitude, but sleep had become an increasingly elusive companion since he'd settled in this remote corner of the territory 3 years prior. The ranch, if it could be called that, consisted of little more than a sturdy log cabin, a small barn, and a corral that housed his 2 horses and handful of cattle. Samuel had chosen this location precisely because of its isolation. Nestled in a valley between red rock mesas, miles from the nearest settlement of Prescott. Here, a man could disappear from the world and its troubles, which was exactly what Samuel had intended after witnessing the carnage of Gettysburg and Antietam. As he walked toward the well to draw water for his morning coffee, something unusual caught his eye. There, beside the wooden gate that marked the entrance to his property, lay what appeared to be a bundle of animal hides. Samuel paused, his hand instinctively moving to the Colt revolver at his hip. In this territory, anything out of place could mean danger. Apache raids were common, and though Samuel had managed to avoid conflict with the local tribes thus far, he knew that peace was often as fragile as morning frost. Approaching cautiously, Samuel's breath caught in his throat. The bundle wasn't hides at all, but rather blankets wrapped around something or someone small. As he knelt beside the gate, he could hear the faint sound of breathing. With trembling hands, he carefully pulled back the topmost blanket to reveal the face of a young Apache girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, unconscious but alive. The child's dark hair was braided with small beads and feathers, and her buckskin dress, though travel-worn, was intricately decorated with porcupine quill work. Her face, peaceful in sleep, bore the high cheekbones and bronze complexion characteristic of her people. Most striking, however, was a small turquoise pendant that hung from a leather cord around her neck, clearly a piece of great significance. Samuel's mind raced as he gently lifted the girl into his arms. Her body was light, almost fragile, and he could feel the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. Why had she been left here? Was this some kind of trap, a test, or perhaps something far more desperate, a parent's last hope for their child's survival? As he carried her toward the house, Samuel noticed tracks in the soft earth around his gate. Unshod horse hooves and moccasin prints told the story of a small party that had approached in the pre-dawn darkness and departed just as quietly. Whoever had brought the child had been skilled in moving unseen, a talent that spoke of Apache training. Inside the cabin, Samuel laid the girl on his own bed, the only one in the single-room dwelling. He fetched a bowl of cool water and a clean cloth, gently wiping the dust and grime from her face. As he worked, he found himself studying her features, wondering about her story, the careful way she had been wrapped, the quality of her clothing, and that precious turquoise pendant all suggested she was no ordinary child. Perhaps she was the daughter of a chief or medicine man. The girl's eyes fluttered open suddenly, dark and alert, despite her apparent exhaustion. For a moment, she stared at Samuel with the wariness of a wild animal, her small body tensing as if preparing to flee. Then, perhaps recognizing her own helplessness, she relaxed slightly, though her gaze never left his face. Samuel spoke softly, using the few Apache words he had learned during his time in the territory. His pronunciation was clumsy, but the attempt seemed to ease some of the fear in the child's eyes. She responded in her native tongue, her voice barely above a whisper, but Samuel could only shake his head apologetically. Their communication would have to rely on gestures and patience. Over the following hours, Samuel discovered that the girl was indeed injured, a nasty gash on her left leg that had been treated with what appeared to be traditional Apache medicine, but still needed proper care. As he cleaned and bandaged the wound, She bore the pain with a stoicism that impressed him. This was no pampered child, but one already hardened by the harsh realities of frontier life. By noon, the girl was sitting up and accepting small sips of water and bites of hardtack softened in warm milk from Samuel's cow. She ate slowly, cautiously, her eyes constantly scanning the room as if memorizing every detail. Samuel found himself doing the same, looking at his sparse living quarters through the eyes of someone from an entirely different world. The cabin was functional but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a small table and 2 chairs, shelves lined with books, and various tools and supplies hanging from wooden pegs. To the Apache girl, these possessions must have seemed strange and foreign, just as her presence had transformed Samuel's carefully ordered solitude into something entirely unexpected. As the afternoon wore on, Samuel attempted to communicate with the child through simple gestures and drawings in the dirt floor. He pointed to himself and said, "Samuel," repeatedly, until she began to understand. When he pointed to her with raised eyebrows, she hesitated before speaking what sounded like Ayana. Samuel repeated the name carefully, and she nodded, the first sign of approval he had received from her. Ayana. Even with his limited knowledge of Apache culture, Samuel sensed this was likely not her real name, or at least not the name she would be known by among her people. Apache children often had multiple names throughout their lives, and giving one's true name to a stranger, especially a white stranger, would be unthinkable. But it was a beginning. As evening approached, Samuel faced a dilemma that would define the weeks and months to come. Should he attempt to find Ayana's people and return her? The nearest Apache settlement was at least 3 days' ride, and venturing into their territory uninvited could prove fatal. Should he take her to the authorities in Prescott? The territorial government's policy toward Apache children was hardly compassionate. She would likely end up in a mission school, stripped of her cultural identity and forced to assimilate. The decision was made for him when Ayana, exhausted from her ordeal, curled up on his bed and fell into a deep sleep. As Samuel watched her small form rise and fall with each breath, he felt something stir within him that he hadn't experienced since the war, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. That night, Samuel made a bed for himself on the floor near the fireplace and lay awake, listening to the sounds of the desert. Coyotes called to each other across the mesas, and somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted its ancient song. But underlying these familiar sounds was something new, the soft breathing of a child who had somehow become his responsibility. The next morning brought new challenges. Ayana's fever had broken during the night, and she was alert and clearly feeling stronger. However, she also seemed more aware of her situation and less willing to accept Samuel's care. When he offered her food, she pushed it away. When he approached to check her bandage, she shrank back against the wall. Samuel realized that trust would not come easily. In Ayana's world, white men were often enemies, soldiers who destroyed villages, settlers who claimed sacred lands, traders who brought disease and whiskey. That she had been left with him at all suggested desperate circumstances, but it didn't mean she had to like the arrangement. Patience became Samuel's greatest ally. He went about his daily routines, feeding the animals, repairing fences, tending his small garden, while allowing Ayana to observe from a distance. Gradually, curiosity began to overcome fear. She watched with fascination as he milked the cow, a creature she had likely never seen up close. When he gathered eggs from his chickens, she followed at a safe distance, her dark eyes wide with interest. By the 3rd day, a tentative routine had developed. Ayana would accept food if Samuel left it within reach and withdrew to the other side of the room. She would drink water from the cup he provided, though she preferred to fetch it herself from the well when she thought he wasn't watching. Most significantly, she had begun to explore the cabin when Samuel was outside, and he would often return to find small objects moved or rearranged, signs that she was trying to understand this strange new world. Communication remained limited, but was slowly improving. Samuel had begun teaching her simple English words while attempting to learn Apache phrases in return. Water became tu, food became itsan, and gradually they built a basic vocabulary that allowed for essential exchanges. Ayana was clearly intelligent, picking up English words with remarkable speed, though she seemed reluctant to use them in Samuel's presence. A week after her arrival, Ayana's leg had healed enough for her to walk without pain, and Samuel faced a decision he had been avoiding. The child was healthy and could presumably travel if someone came to claim her, but no one had come. Each day, he scanned the horizon for signs of Apache riders, but the desert remained empty except for the occasional hawk or roadrunner. It was during this time that Samuel began to notice the subtle ways Ayana was adapting to her new environment. She had learned to open the cabin door by standing on a wooden crate, and she had figured out how to work the pump at the well. Most remarkably, she had begun to help with small tasks around the ranch, gathering eggs, feeding the chickens, even attempting to milk the cow, though that particular endeavor had ended with more milk on the ground than in the bucket. These developments filled Samuel with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he was pleased to see Ayana becoming more comfortable and confident. On the other hand, each sign of her adaptation made the possibility of her eventual departure more difficult to contemplate. Somewhere along the way, without quite realizing it, Samuel had begun to think of her not as a temporary responsibility, but as something approaching family. The transformation wasn't limited to Ayana. Samuel found himself changing as well. The careful routines that had structured his solitary existence gave way to new patterns centered around the child's needs and interests. He began preparing meals with greater care, considering what might appeal to someone who had grown up on a diet of game meat, pinyon nuts, and cactus fruit. He found himself talking more, even when Ayana didn't respond, simply because the silence that had once comforted him now felt oppressive. Most significantly, Samuel discovered that having someone to care for had rekindled something in him that the war had nearly extinguished: hope for the future. For 3 years, he had lived day to day, season to season, with no thought beyond basic survival. Now, he found himself planning ahead, considering what Ayana might need as she grew, what skills he could teach her, what kind of life they might build together, if circumstances allowed. But circumstances in the Arizona Territory were rarely accommodating, and Samuel's growing attachment to the Apache child existed in the shadow of larger forces that cared nothing for individual hopes and dreams. The territorial government was under pressure from Washington to resolve the Apache problem once and for all. General George Crook had been appointed to lead a new campaign against the resistant tribes, and rumors of impending military action filled the conversations in Prescott's saloons and trading posts. Samuel had managed to avoid these larger conflicts during his years of self-imposed exile, but he knew that neutrality might not be possible much longer. If war came, and most frontier residents believed it inevitable, every white settler would be expected to choose sides. The presence of an Apache child in his household would complicate that choice immeasurably. For now, however, such concerns remained distant possibilities. The immediate reality was simpler and more profound: a lonely man and a displaced child learning to coexist in a harsh and beautiful land that belonged fully to neither of them. Each day brought small discoveries and minor triumphs. Ayana learned to use a fork and knife, though she still preferred eating with her hands. Samuel learned to braid her hair in a style that approximated what he remembered from her arrival, though his clumsy fingers could never match the intricate patterns of Apache tradition. They developed a routine of evening walks around the property, with Ayana pointing to various plants and animals and teaching Samuel their Apache names. In return, he shared what he knew about the European names for the same creatures, an exchange that seemed to delight them both. During these walks, Samuel began to see his adopted home through Ayana's eyes, noticing details that had escaped his attention during 3 years of solitary residence. She showed him which cactus pads were best for eating and which should be avoided, knowledge that might prove valuable during lean times. She identified tracks and signs that told stories about the nocturnal activities of desert creatures, which water sources were favored by deer, where rabbits nested, which trees housed families of pack rats. Her connection to the natural world was profound and intuitive, a reminder that for her people, survival depended on such intimate knowledge of the land. As the weeks passed, Samuel began to understand that Ayana's presence was not just changing his daily routine, but fundamentally altering his relationship with the territory itself. What had once been simply a place to hide from the world was becoming, through her eyes, a complex ecosystem worthy of respect and careful study. The desert was not empty wasteland to be endured, but a living entity with its own rhythms and requirements. This shift in perspective came none too soon, as the first serious test of their newfound stability arrived in the form of visitors. Samuel was repairing a broken fence post on a hot afternoon in early August when the sound of approaching horses reached his ears. 2 riders were coming up the valley, still distant but clearly heading for his ranch. In this isolated location, any visitor was cause for concern, but these riders moved with the purposeful pace of men on official business. Samuel quickly looked around for Ayana and spotted her near the chicken coop where she had been gathering eggs. Their eyes met across the yard, and without a word, she melted into the shadows behind the barn, a skill that reminded Samuel forcefully of her Apache heritage. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, he would face it alone, at least ostensibly. The riders proved to be Territorial Marshal William Brady and his deputy, a young man named Tom Henderson, whom Samuel recognized from his occasional trips to Prescott for supplies. Brady was a veteran lawman with thinning gray hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in the saddle under the desert sun. Henderson was perhaps 25, eager and serious, the sort of man who took his badge seriously and probably slept with his gun within easy reach. After the customary greetings and the ritual sharing of water, essential courtesies in desert country, Brady got to the point of his visit. There had been reports of Apache activity in the area, he explained. A band led by a war chief named Geronimo had been raiding settlements to the south, and there were concerns that other groups might be moving through the territory. As the most isolated settler in this part of the valley, Samuel needed to be warned of the potential danger. Samuel listened carefully, asking appropriate questions about the raids and nodding gravely at Brady's advice to remain vigilant. Inwardly, however, his mind was racing. If Apache war parties were indeed moving through the area, Ayana's people might be among them. The possibility that her family, or at least her tribe, might be nearby filled him with a mixture of hope and dread. As the conversation continued, Samuel became aware that Brady was studying him with the sharp eyes of a man trained to notice inconsistencies. When the marshal commented on the improved appearance of Samuel's property, the cleaner cabin, the more organized corral, the better tended garden, Samuel had to think quickly to explain the changes without mentioning his young houseguest. The deputy Henderson was more directly suspicious. He walked around the property while Brady talked, ostensibly checking for signs of trouble, but clearly cataloging everything he saw. When he returned from his circuit, he reported finding small footprints near the well and what looked like child's handprints on the corral fence. The moment stretched uncomfortably as both lawmen stared at Samuel, waiting for an explanation. Samuel's mind raced through possible responses, each seeming more implausible than the last. Finally, he settled on a version of the truth that might satisfy their curiosity without revealing Ayana's presence. He explained that he had indeed had a visitor recently, a Mexican trader's family that had stopped for water and food while traveling north to Colorado. The family had included several children, which would account for the small prints Henderson had discovered. It was a plausible story, and Mexican traders did occasionally pass through the territory, though usually by more established routes. Brady seemed satisfied with this explanation, but Henderson continued to look skeptical. The young deputy's eyes kept scanning the property, as if expecting to spot something his colleague had missed. Samuel found himself holding his breath, hoping that Ayanna would remain hidden until the lawman departed. The visit concluded with renewed warnings about the Apache threat and an invitation for Samuel to take shelter in Prescott if the situation deteriorated. As the two riders prepared to leave, Brady made one final comment that sent a chill down Samuel's spine. There were rumors, the marshal said, that some Apache groups had been abandoning their children with white settlers, either as a desperate attempt to save them from the coming war, or as some kind of infiltration strategy. Any settler who discovered such a child was legally obligated to turn the child over to territorial authorities immediately. The words hung in the desert air like a physical weight as Brady and Henderson rode away. Samuel watched them disappear over the ridge before calling softly for Ayanna. She emerged from her hiding place slowly, her dark eyes filled with questions he couldn't answer. Somehow, without either of them speaking English or Apache, she seemed to understand that their peaceful existence had just become far more complicated. That evening, as they sat by the fire after their usual silent supper, Samuel found himself studying Ayanna's face in the flickering light. The turquoise pendant at her throat caught the flames and seemed to glow with its own inner fire. Who was she really? What circumstances had brought her to his gate? And most urgently, what would happen if the authorities discovered her presence? These questions would have to wait for answers, however, because the next morning brought a development that would change everything once again. Samuel woke before dawn, as was his habit, and stepped outside to begin his daily routine. But as he reached for the water bucket beside the door, movement on the ridge above his property caught his eye. Silhouetted against the pale pre-dawn sky, perfectly motionless but unmistakably present, sat a lone Apache warrior on horseback. Even at that distance, Samuel could see the man's attention was focused entirely on the ranch below. The watcher made no attempt to hide his presence. If anything, he seemed to want to be seen. Samuel's heart began to pound as he realized what this meant. Ayanna's people had found her. After weeks of waiting and wondering, the moment of truth had finally arrived. As he stood frozen in his doorway, Samuel heard the soft sound of bare feet behind him. Ayanna had awakened and joined him at the threshold. When she saw the figure on the ridge, her entire body went rigid. Her hand flew to the turquoise pendant at her throat, and she spoke a single word in Apache so quietly that Samuel almost missed it. But the emotion in her voice, a mixture of longing, fear, and something that might have been recognition, was unmistakable. The Apache warrior remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, with deliberate slowness, he raised one hand in what might have been a greeting or a warning before turning his horse and disappearing beyond the ridge. Samuel and Ayanna stood in the doorway until the sun was fully above the horizon, but the watcher did not return. However, his message had been clear. They knew where she was, and they were watching. The question now was what they intended to do about it. As the morning progressed, Samuel found it impossible to concentrate on his usual tasks. Every sound seemed amplified. Every shadow potentially concealed a threat or an opportunity. Ayanna, too, seemed affected by the morning's encounter. She remained close to the cabin, starting at every noise, her eyes frequently turning toward the ridge where the warrior had appeared. By afternoon, Samuel had made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. If Ayanna's people wanted her back, he would not resist. Despite the growing bond between them, despite his own growing attachment to the child, he knew that she belonged with her own people. The approaching conflict between the territorial government and the Apache tribes would likely make any other choice impossible anyway. But as he tried to communicate this decision to Ayanna through gestures and the few Apache words he knew, her response shocked him. She shook her head violently and backed away from him, her eyes wide with what looked like panic. When he persisted in trying to explain, She ran to the cabin and barricaded herself inside, refusing to come out even when he promised he wouldn't force her to leave. The impasse continued until evening, when Samuel finally understood the source of Ayana's distress. She wasn't afraid of being returned to her people. She was afraid of being abandoned again. In her young mind, Samuel's willingness to let her go must have seemed like another rejection, another instance of being cast aside by adults whose decisions she couldn't control or influence. This realization forced Samuel to confront the true complexity of their situation. Ayana was caught between two worlds, neither of which could guarantee her safety or happiness. Among her own people, she would face the uncertainties of a culture under siege, a way of life threatened with extinction. With him, she would be forever displaced from her heritage, cut off from the traditions and knowledge that should have been her birthright. As Samuel pondered these impossible choices, he became aware that they were no longer alone. The soft nicker of horses carried across the valley, followed by the barely audible sound of voices speaking in Apache. Peering through the cabin window, Samuel could see the glow of a small fire on the same ridge where the lone warrior had appeared that morning. Ayana saw it too, and her reaction was immediate and decisive. She moved to the cabin door and, after a moment's hesitation, stepped outside into the gathering darkness. Samuel followed, uncertain whether he should try to stop her or simply witness whatever was about to unfold. What happened next would remain etched in Samuel's memory for the rest of his life. As they stood together in the doorway, three figures emerged from the darkness of the valley floor. They moved like shadows made manifest, so quietly that Samuel's horses didn't even lift their heads from grazing. The leader was an elderly Apache man, his long gray hair adorned with feathers and his weathered face marked by the ritual scars of a medicine man. Behind him walked a woman of perhaps 30 years, her bearing regal despite her simple buckskin dress. The third figure was the warrior from the morning, now clearly visible as a man in his prime, armed but not threatening. The small group stopped perhaps 20 feet from the cabin, close enough for conversation but far enough to avoid seeming aggressive. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the elderly man began to chant in Apache, his voice carrying across the desert air with the resonance of ancient authority. Ayana stepped forward, her small hand finding Samuel's larger one and gripping it tightly. When the chanting stopped, she spoke in Apache, her young voice clear and strong despite her obvious nervousness. Samuel couldn't understand her words, but he could hear the emotion behind them, a mixture of respect, longing, and what sounded like explanation or justification. The woman stepped forward then, and Samuel gasped as he saw her face clearly in the starlight. The resemblance to Ayana was unmistakable, the same high cheekbones, the same intelligent dark eyes, the same proud bearing. This had to be her mother, or at least a close relative. The reunion that followed was unlike anything Samuel had expected. Instead of rushing into each other's arms, mother and daughter approached each other with ceremonial slowness, speaking in voices too low for Samuel to hear. When they finally embraced, it was with a restrained emotion that spoke of cultural traditions stronger than individual feeling. But it was what happened next that truly surprised Samuel. After several minutes of conversation in Apache, the elderly man approached him directly and began to speak in careful, accented English. "You are Samuel Morrison," the medicine man said, and it wasn't a question. "You fought in the white man's war. You came to this place to find peace." Samuel nodded, too astonished to speak. How did this Apache elder know so much about him? "The child you call Ayana has told us much about you," the man continued. "She says you have treated her with kindness, that you have shared your food and your shelter without asking for anything in return. This is unexpected from one of your people." "He's a good child," Samuel managed to say. "I couldn't have done otherwise." The medicine man studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Yes, I believe this is true, but now we must speak of difficult things. The white soldiers are coming with new orders to destroy all Apache who will not surrender. There will be no more places to hide, no more seasons of peace. Our children must be protected, even if it means great sacrifice. Samuel felt his heart sinking as he realized what was coming. Despite their apparent approval of his care for Ayanna, her people had come to take her back. It was the right thing, the natural thing, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. But the medicine man's next words caught him completely off guard. "We have watched you for many days," the elder said. "We have seen how the child thrives under your care, how she has learned your ways while keeping her own spirit strong. We have a proposal to make, one that may seem strange to your people and to ours." The proposal, when it came, was indeed unlike anything Samuel could have imagined. The Apache band, led by the medicine man whose name was Nalnish, was preparing to move deeper into the mountains, where they hoped to avoid the coming military campaign. But they knew that such refuge was temporary at best. Eventually, they would be found and forced onto a reservation, or worse. Ayanna, however, represented a different kind of hope. If she remained with Samuel, she might survive the coming troubles while still maintaining her connection to Apache culture. Nalnish and his people would continue to visit periodically, teaching her the traditions and stories of her people while allowing her to learn the skills she would need to survive in the white man's world. It was an unprecedented arrangement, one that violated the expectations of both cultures. But these were unprecedented times, and desperate situations sometimes called for extraordinary solutions. The key, Nalnish explained, was that Samuel would not be adopting Ayanna in the white man's sense. She would remain Apache in spirit and identity while living under his protection. The woman who was indeed Ayanna's mother, whose name was Desba, spoke then for the first time. Her English was more limited than Nalnish's, but her meaning was clear. She had lost 2 other children to the white man's diseases, and her husband had been killed in a skirmish with cavalry soldiers 6 months earlier. Ayanna was all she had left, and ensuring her daughter's survival was more important than maintaining traditional family structures. "You understand," Desba said, her dark eyes boring into Samuel's. "She is still my daughter, always my daughter. You will keep her safe, but you will not make her forget who she is." Samuel found himself nodding before he had fully processed the implications of what he was agreeing to. The arrangement would require him to walk an impossibly narrow line between 2 worlds, protecting Ayanna from those who would see her Apache heritage as a threat, while ensuring that heritage remained alive within her. As dawn approached, the details of this extraordinary agreement were worked out. Nalnish and his people would establish a hidden camp in the mountains, far enough from the ranch to avoid detection, but close enough for periodic contact. Every few months, they would send a messenger to check on Ayanna's welfare and to continue her education in Apache ways. In return, Samuel would provide her with protection, shelter, and education in the skills she would need to navigate the white world. Most importantly, he would never reveal her true identity to the territorial authorities or anyone else who might use that information to harm her or her people. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the Apache visitors prepared to depart. The farewell between Ayanna and her mother was heartbreaking in its restraint, both understanding that this might be the last time they saw each other, but neither willing to show weakness that might make the separation even more difficult. Nalnish placed his weathered hand on Samuel's shoulder as the others mounted their horses. "You have been chosen for this task, not by chance, but by the spirits who guide all things," the old medicine man said. "The child will face great trials in the years to come, trials that will test everything we have taught her and everything you will teach her. Help her to be strong in both worlds." As the 3 Apache riders disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, Samuel and Ayanna stood together in a silence that felt different from any they had shared before. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance, nor were they quite the impromptu family they had been becoming. They were something new, a white man and an Apache child bound together by an agreement that defied the expectations of their respective peoples. Ayana looked up at Samuel with eyes that seemed older than her years, and for the first time since her arrival, she spoke to him in clear, careful English. "Will you really keep me safe?" she asked, her small voice carrying the weight of a question that encompassed far more than physical protection. Samuel knelt beside her, looking directly into those dark, intelligent eyes. "I promise," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." As the sun rose fully above the Arizona mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, Samuel Morrison and the Apache girl called Ayana began the next chapter of their extraordinary story. Neither could know what challenges lay ahead, but both understood that their lives had been forever changed by the events of this remarkable night. The first test of their new arrangement would come sooner than either expected, but for now, they had each other and the promise of something unprecedented in the violent history of the territorial frontier, a bridge between two worlds built on trust, respect, and the simple human desire to protect what matters most. In the distance, a hawk circled high above the valley, its cry echoing off the red rock walls like a blessing or a warning. The story of the Apache girl and the white man who raised her was just beginning, and already the desert itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would unfold in the chapters yet to come. Chapter 2. The Weight of Secrets. 3 months had passed since the night that changed everything. The Arizona autumn of 1867 painted the desert in muted browns and golds, and Samuel Morrison had settled into a routine that felt both natural and precarious. Each morning, he would wake to find Ayana already up, quietly preparing their simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee. She had learned to grind the beans in the hand mill he had purchased during his last trip to Prescott, and the rich aroma of fresh coffee had become one of the small pleasures that marked the beginning of each day. The child had grown in the months since her family's visit, not just in height and strength, but in confidence and skill. Her English had improved dramatically, though she still spoke with careful precision, choosing each word as if it carried special weight. Samuel had begun teaching her to read, using his collection of books, and her quick mind absorbed the lessons with an eagerness that both impressed and worried him. In a territory where many white settlers could barely write their own names, an educated Apache girl would attract dangerous attention. But it was her other education that truly amazed Samuel. True to their promise, Nalnish and his people had maintained contact through a network of signals and secret visits that Samuel was only beginning to understand. Sometimes he would find small gifts left near the well, carved bone needles, bundles of medicinal herbs, or intricately woven baskets that appeared overnight like morning dew. Ayana would discover these offerings with quiet joy, and through them, Samuel began to appreciate the sophistication of Apache craft and knowledge. More significant were the visits from Ayana's teacher, an Apache woman named Ithe, who came every few weeks disguised as a traveling Mexican herb seller. To any casual observer, she was simply another wandering trader, offering remedies and charms to isolated settlers. But Samuel had learned to recognize the signs of her approach, the way Ayana would become restless and watchful, the subtle changes in the behavior of desert animals, the almost imperceptible tracks that marked Ithe's careful passage through the valley. During these visits, which never lasted more than a few hours, Ayana would disappear with her teacher into the desert, returning with new knowledge of traditional Apache ways. She learned to identify dozens of plants and their uses, to read the stories written in animal tracks, and to move through the landscape with the silent grace of her ancestors. Most importantly, Ithe taught her the songs and stories that preserved Apache history and culture, ensuring that Ayana's connection to her people remained strong despite her unusual circumstances. Samuel respected these lessons, though they filled him with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he understood the importance of preserving Ayana's heritage and maintaining her bonds with her people. On the other hand, each skill she learned in moving unseen through the desert reminded him of how easily she could disappear from his life if circumstances changed. The girl who gathered eggs in his chicken coop each morning was the same one who could vanish into the rocks and shadows like smoke when Itay called. It was during one of these teaching visits that Samuel first learned of the growing danger that threatened their fragile arrangement. Itay had arrived earlier than usual, her normally composed demeanor marked by an urgency that immediately put Samuel on alert. After spending an hour with Ayana among the rocks behind the ranch, she approached Samuel with news that sent cold fear racing through his veins. "General Crook has received new orders," Ithay told him in her careful English. "The white chiefs in the distant city have grown impatient with the Apache resistance. There will be a great campaign before the winter ends. All Apache found off the reservation will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly." Samuel understood the implications immediately. The military campaign would sweep through the territory like a grass fire, and any evidence of Apache presence, including an Apache child living with a white settler, would bring swift and brutal retaliation. The arrangement that had seemed workable in the relative peace of late summer suddenly appeared impossibly dangerous. "What does Nalnish want me to do?" Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. Itty was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes scanning the horizon as if checking for threats. "He says the spirits have not yet shown him the path, but he asks that you be ready to make difficult choices when the time comes. The child's safety must be the first concern, even if it means great sacrifice for all of us." The cryptic warning haunted Samuel for days after Itay's departure. He found himself studying Ayana with new intensity, memorizing the sound of her laughter when she played with the barn cats, the way she hummed Apache songs while working in the garden, the serious expression she wore when practicing her letters on the slate board he had made for her. If their time together was limited, he wanted to remember every detail. Ayana seemed to sense his unease, though she didn't question it directly. Instead, she began spending more time close to him, helping with tasks that she normally handled independently, asking questions about his past that she had never shown interest in before. It was as if she too felt the weight of approaching change and wanted to strengthen the bonds between them while there was still time. The first concrete sign of the coming storm arrived on a crisp October morning in the form of a dust cloud on the eastern horizon. Samuel was repairing the roof of his chicken coop when he spotted the telltale sign of multiple riders approaching at speed. His heart hammered against his ribs as he counted at least 6 horses, more than any routine patrol would include. "Ayana," he called quietly, not wanting to alarm her but needing to ensure she was prepared. She appeared from behind the barn where she had been gathering dried corn stalks for winter storage. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know. Without a word, she melted into the rocks and brush behind the property, disappearing so completely that Samuel might have doubted her existence if not for the warm touch of her hand on his arm just moments before. The riders proved to be a cavalry patrol led by Captain James Sullivan, a career soldier with the weathered look of a man who had spent too many years fighting Apache in the unforgiving desert. Sullivan was accompanied by 5 troopers, and most ominously, a civilian scout whose mix of white and Apache features marked him as one of the controversial Apache scouts employed by the army to track their own people. After the customary greetings and the offer of water, Captain Sullivan explained the purpose of his visit. The military was conducting a comprehensive survey of all settlements in the territory, cataloging resources and assessing defensive capabilities in preparation for the coming campaign. Every settler would be required to register with the territorial authorities and provide detailed information about their property, livestock, and household members. Samuel's mouth went dry as he realized the implications. The registration process would inevitably reveal any irregularities in his living situation, and a thorough search of his property might uncover evidence of Ayana's presence. Blankets sized for a child, clothes he had sewn for her, the smaller dishes and utensils she used, a dozen small details that would betray the secret he had worked so hard to protect. "I trust you won't mind if we look around," Captain Sullivan said, though his tone made it clear that permission was not actually being requested. "Standard procedure, you understand. We need to ensure that all territorial residents are accounted for and that no unauthorized persons are harboring hostile Indians." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, though he managed to keep his expression neutral. "Of course, Captain. Though I should warn you, there's not much to see. I live a simple life out here." As the soldiers spread out to examine his property, Samuel found himself silently grateful for Ayana's intelligence and training. She had learned to be scrupulously careful about leaving evidence of her presence, washing her own dishes and putting them away, keeping her few possessions hidden in a secret compartment they had built beneath the cabin floor, even smoothing the ground around the well to eliminate the smaller footprints that had aroused suspicion during Marshal Brady's visit. But no amount of caution could eliminate every trace, and Samuel's heart nearly stopped when one of the troopers emerged from the cabin holding a small moccasin that must have been overlooked in their hasty preparations. "Captain," the soldier called, holding up the beaded footwear, "found this under the bed. Looks Apache made." Captain Sullivan examined the moccasin with the practiced eye of a man who had seen countless examples of Apache craftswork. His expression grew grim as he turned to face Samuel. "This is a child's shoe, Morrison. Care to explain how it came to be in your possession?" Samuel's mind raced through possible explanations, but he knew that any story he invented would be subjected to intense scrutiny. The moccasin was clearly Apache, clearly sized for a young child, and clearly not a mere souvenir or trade item. Finally, he settled on a version of truth that might satisfy the captain's suspicions without betraying Ayana's current presence. "Found it a few months back," Samuel said, working to keep his voice steady. "There was evidence of Apache activity near my water source. Tracks, signs of a temporary camp, must have been dropped during their passage." Captain Sullivan studied him intently, clearly weighing the plausibility of this explanation. The Apache scout, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward and examined the moccasin more closely. When he spoke, his words sent ice through Samuel's veins. "This shoe is not old," the scout said in accented English. "The leather is supple, the beadwork bright. It has been worn recently, perhaps within days or weeks. And see here," he pointed to the sole of the moccasin. "The wear pattern shows it was used on ground like this. Rocky desert soil, not mountain terrain where most Apache bands are hiding." The implications hung heavy in the desert air. If the moccasin was recently worn, and if it showed wear patterns consistent with the local terrain, then its owner had been in the immediate area within the recent past. Captain Sullivan's expression hardened as he processed this information. "Sergeant Williams," the captain ordered, "conduct a thorough search of the property. Check every building, every hiding place, every possible concealment. If there are Apache in this area, I want them found." The next hour was the longest of Samuel's life. The soldiers turned his property upside down, examining every corner of the cabin, searching the barn from floor to rafters, even checking the chicken coop and the small root cellar where he stored vegetables for winter. Samuel watched with growing anxiety, knowing that despite their precautions, something would eventually betray Ayana's presence. But as the search continued without result, Samuel began to hope that they might escape detection. Ayana's Apache training served her well. She had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Even the scout, with his mixed heritage and intimate knowledge of Apache ways, found no trace of her hiding place among the rocks and brush behind the property. It was the horses that finally betrayed them. As the soldiers prepared to conclude their search, Samuel's mare began nickering softly and looking toward a cluster of boulders about 50 yards from the house. The behavior was subtle, the kind of thing most people would overlook, but the Apache scout noticed immediately. "The horses sense something," he told Captain Sullivan. "They are responding to a presence we have not yet found." The scout approached the boulder cluster with the patient intensity of a predator. Samuel watched helplessly as the man examined the ground, reading signs invisible to white eyes. After several minutes, The scout straightened and beckoned to Captain Sullivan. "Someone has been here recently," he announced. "The stones have been disturbed, rearranged to create a hiding place, and here," he pointed to a barely visible depression in the sandy soil. A small footprint, pressed deep enough to suggest someone crouching for an extended period. Captain Sullivan's patience was clearly exhausted. "Morrison," he barked, "I'm going to ask you one more time. Are you harboring Apache Indians on this property?" Samuel faced an impossible choice. Lying to a federal officer during an official investigation could result in charges of treason or collaboration with hostile Indians, crimes that carried severe penalties, possibly including death. But telling the truth would almost certainly result in Ayana's capture and removal to a reservation or worse. The promise he had made to protect her warred with his instinct for self-preservation. Before he could answer, however, the decision was taken out of his hands. A small voice called out from the rocks, speaking words in Apache that Samuel didn't understand, but whose tone conveyed surrender and dignity. Ayana emerged from her hiding place with the same ceremonial composure she had shown during her reunion with her mother. She walked toward the soldiers with her head held high, her dark eyes showing no fear despite the gravity of her situation. The turquoise pendant at her throat caught the afternoon sunlight and seemed to glow with its own inner fire. The effect on the soldiers was immediate and dramatic. Captain Sullivan's hand moved instinctively to his sidearm, though he didn't draw the weapon. The troopers formed a defensive circle, as if a single 7-year-old girl represented a military threat. Only the Apache scout remained calm, studying Ayana with an expression that might have been recognition or respect. "Well, Morrison," Captain Sullivan said grimly, "it seems we have our answer. You are indeed harboring a hostile Indian child. By the authority vested in me by the territorial government and the United States Army, I am placing you under arrest for collaboration with enemy combatants." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, but his primary concern was for Ayana. She stood motionless among the circle of soldiers, showing no sign of the fear that must have been coursing through her. When her eyes met Samuel's across the dusty yard, he saw not accusation, but understanding. She knew he had done everything he could to protect her. "Captain," Samuel said, working to keep his voice level, "the child has done nothing wrong. Whatever charges you bring against me, she doesn't deserve to be punished for my decisions." Captain Sullivan's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Deserve has nothing to do with it, Morrison. This child is Apache, which makes her a potential threat to every white settler in the territory. She'll be transported to the reservation where she can be properly supervised and educated in civilized ways." The word civilized seemed to strike Ayana like a physical blow. For the first time since emerging from hiding, her composure cracked slightly. She spoke a few words in Apache, her young voice carrying a dignity that made the surrounding soldiers seem crude and barbarous by comparison. The Apache scout translated her words for Captain Sullivan. "She says she has committed no crimes against the white man's people. She asks why she is being punished for the accident of her birth." Captain Sullivan's face flushed red at the implied criticism. "Tell her that she'll have plenty of time to learn about civilized behavior at the reservation school. Now bind her hands. I won't have any escape attempts during transport." "That won't be necessary," Samuel said quickly, stepping toward Ayana despite the weapons pointed in his direction. "She won't try to escape. Will you, Ayana?" The girl looked up at him with eyes that seemed far older than her years. After a moment, she nodded slowly. "I will not run," she said in careful English, "but I will remember this day, and I will remember who showed kindness and who did not." The simple dignity of her words seemed to shame some of the younger soldiers, though Captain Sullivan remained unmoved. As preparations were made for the journey to Prescott, Samuel was allowed a few minutes to gather his own belongings before being taken into custody. During this brief respite, he managed a whispered conversation with Ayana while pretending to help her prepare for travel. "Remember what Nalnish taught you," he told her quietly. Remember who you are, no matter what they try to make you forget. And remember that you always have a home here, whenever you can return to it." Ayana nodded, her small hand briefly squeezing his before the soldiers separated them. As she was helped onto one of the cavalry horses, Samuel caught a glimpse of something in her expression that gave him hope. Beneath the apparent submission was a steely determination that reminded him powerfully of her Apache heritage. This was not a child who would be easily broken, no matter what trials lay ahead. The journey to Prescott took 2 days, with the party camping overnight in a sheltered canyon that provided protection from the autumn winds. Samuel was kept under close guard, his hands bound and his movements restricted, but he was able to observe Ayana's behavior during the trip. She ate when food was offered, drank when given water, and responded politely to direct questions, but otherwise maintained a silence that seemed to unnerve some of the soldiers. It was during the second night, as Samuel lay on his bedroll listening to the coyotes sing in the darkness, that he overheard a conversation between Captain Sullivan and his Apache scout that filled him with both information and dread. "What do you think of the girl?" Sullivan asked in a voice low enough that he probably thought Samuel couldn't hear. The scout was quiet for a long moment before responding. "She is not ordinary Apache child. The pendant she wears, the way she carries herself, the words she chooses when she speaks, these things suggest important family connections. Her people will not forget her capture." "Are you saying there might be rescue attempts?" "I am saying that taking this child may have consequences beyond what you anticipate. The Apache value their children above all else, and they have long memories for both kindness and injury." Captain Sullivan's response was dismissive, but Samuel could hear an undertone of concern. "Let them try. We'll be ready for anything they might attempt." But as Samuel lay awake under the vast desert sky, he wondered if the captain truly understood what he had set in motion. The capture of an Apache child, especially one who might be connected to important tribal leaders, could escalate the brewing conflict in ways that no one could predict. The delicate balance that had allowed Ayana to live peacefully at his ranch had been shattered, and the consequences would ripple outward like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The arrival in Prescott brought new challenges and unexpected complications. The territorial capital was bustling with military activity as preparations for the Apache campaign reached fever pitch. Soldiers filled the streets, supply wagons created traffic jams at every intersection, and the air rang with the sounds of a community preparing for war. Samuel was taken immediately to the territorial jail, a sturdy adobe building that had been designed more for holding drunks and minor criminals than for serious offenders. As he was processed and placed in a cell, he caught glimpses of Ayana being escorted toward a different building, the territorial school that also served as a processing center for Indian children removed from their families. The separation was more painful than Samuel had anticipated. For months, they had been constant companions, sharing meals and conversations, working together on the daily tasks that sustained life in the desert. Now, confined to a cramped cell with only a small barred window for light and air, Samuel found himself haunted by worries about Ayana's welfare. His concerns were not misplaced. The territorial school, run by a stern missionary named Reverend Marcus Whitman, operated on the principle that Indian children could only be saved by completely severing their connections to tribal culture. Students were forbidden to speak their native languages, forced to adopt European-style clothing and hairstyles, and subjected to rigid discipline designed to break their will and remake them in the white man's image. For Ayana, who had spent months learning to balance two cultures while maintaining her essential identity, the shock of this environment was profound. Her long black hair was cut short in the institutional style. Her buckskin dress was replaced with a rough cotton uniform, and the turquoise pendant that connected her to her family was confiscated as a heathen artifact. But perhaps most devastating was the systematic attempt to strip away her name and identity. She was assigned the European name Mary, and told that her Apache identity was a relic of savagery that must be abandoned if she hoped to find salvation. When she persisted in speaking Apache words or humming traditional songs, she was subjected to punishments that ranged from missed meals to physical discipline. Through the bars of his cell window, Samuel could sometimes hear the sounds from the school, children reciting lessons in mechanical unison, the sharp crack of a ruler across knuckles, the muffled sobs of homesick students. Each sound was a reminder of his failure to protect the child who had been entrusted to his care. It was during his third day in jail that Samuel received an unexpected visitor. Marshal Brady, the same lawman who had warned him about Apache activity months earlier, appeared at his cell with an expression that mixed official duty with personal concern. "Morrison," Brady said, settling onto a wooden stool outside the cell door, "you found yourself in a considerable amount of trouble." Samuel looked up from where he had been sitting on his narrow bunk, staring at the wall. "I suppose I have, Marshal. Though I'm not entirely sure I understand what law I'm supposed to have broken." Brady pulled out a sheet of paper and consulted it with the air of a man reading charges he didn't entirely believe in. Harboring hostile Indians, failure to report the presence of enemy combatants, conspiracy to aid and abet enemies of the territorial government. Take your pick. Any one of them could get you 5 years in territorial prison. "And what about Ayana?" Samuel asked, though he dreaded the answer. The marshal's expression softened slightly. "The girl. She's been assigned to the territorial school for proper education and cultural correction. Reverend Whitman thinks she can be successfully civilized, given time and proper instruction." The euphemistic language didn't disguise the reality of what was happening. Ayana was being systematically stripped of everything that made her who she was. Reformed according to the prejudices and assumptions of people who saw her Apache heritage as something to be cured rather than valued. "There might be another option," Brady continued, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Captain Sullivan is planning a reconnaissance mission into Apache territory, trying to locate the hostile bands before the main campaign begins. He could use a guide with local knowledge, someone who knows the terrain and might have insights into Apache behavior." Samuel understood immediately what was being offered. In exchange for his cooperation in hunting down Apache groups, quite possibly including Ayana's own family, he might earn leniency for his supposed crimes. It was a devil's bargain that would require him to betray everything he had come to understand about honor and loyalty. "I won't help hunt down innocent people," Samuel said firmly. "Whatever punishment you think I deserve, I won't buy my freedom with Apache blood." Marshal Brady nodded as if he had expected this response. "I thought you might feel that way, but you should know that Captain Sullivan is planning to use the girl as bait if necessary. Her connections to the local Apache bands make her valuable for intelligence purposes." The implication hit Samuel like a physical blow. They intended to use Ayana to draw out her people, exploiting a child's family bonds to set traps for the very individuals who had shown such trust in allowing her to remain with him. The betrayal was so profound that Samuel felt physically sick. "You can't let them do that," he said, gripping the cell bars. "She's just a child. She has nothing to do with any of this conflict." "I'm afraid I don't have much influence over military decisions," Brady replied, though his tone suggested he found the plan distasteful. "But there might be another way to help her, if you're willing to listen to a proposal that comes from sources I can't officially acknowledge." The cryptic offer intrigued Samuel, despite his suspicion of any deal that involved the territorial authorities. Brady glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard before continuing in a voice barely above a whisper. "There are people in Prescott who don't approve of the military's methods regarding Indian children. People with influence who might be able to arrange for the girl's release, provided she had somewhere safe to go, somewhere far from the territory, where the questions about her background wouldn't arise." Samuel's heart leaped at the possibility, but he forced himself to consider the implications carefully. What would that require? Your cooperation in leaving the territory permanently. No questions asked, no looking back, No attempts to contact Apache groups or interfere with military operations. You and the girl would disappear, and in exchange, the charges against you would be quietly dropped and forgotten. It was exile, pure and simple. The life Samuel had built in Arizona, the home he had created in the desert, the connections he had formed with the land and its people, all of it would have to be abandoned. But weighed against Ayana's welfare, the choice seemed clear. "I need to think about it," Samuel said, though he already knew what his answer would be. "Don't think too long," Brady warned. "Captain Sullivan is planning to put his plan into action within the week. Once the girl becomes an active part of military operations, there won't be anything anyone can do to help her." That night, as Samuel lay sleepless in his cell, he found himself remembering the promise he had made to Nalnish and Desba. He had sworn to protect Ayana, to keep her safe, while preserving her connection to her Apache heritage. The current situation represented a complete failure of that promise, but perhaps there was still time to fulfill its spirit, if not its letter. The decision came to him with surprising clarity as he watched the desert stars through his small window. He would accept whatever deal was necessary to secure Ayana's freedom, even if it meant leaving behind everything he had built in Arizona. The child's welfare was more important than his own desires or comfort. But even as he made this resolution, Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that larger forces were at work, that the capture of one Apache girl was part of a broader tragedy that would reshape the entire territory. The approaching military campaign would bring destruction and displacement to countless families, separating children from parents and shattering communities that had existed for generations. In the morning, Samuel would give Marshal Brady his answer and begin the process of arranging their escape from Arizona. But tonight, he could only lie awake and listen to the distant sounds of a territory preparing for war, knowing that whatever happened next would mark the end of one chapter of his life and the beginning of another entirely. The weight of these changes pressed down on him like the desert heat, inescapable and transformative. Somewhere across town, Ayana was enduring her own trials, probably lying awake in an institutional dormitory, missing the freedom of the desert and the simple comforts of the life they had built together. The thought of her loneliness and confusion gave Samuel the strength he needed to face whatever sacrifices lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult choices, but tonight was for remembering the good times, the sound of Ayana's laughter as she chased chickens around the yard, the pride in her voice when she successfully read a difficult passage from one of his books, the peaceful evenings when they sat together watching the sunset over the Red Rock mesas. These memories would have to sustain him through whatever trials lay ahead, reminders of what they had shared and what they might hope to build again in some distant place where the conflicts of the Arizona territory could not reach them. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, marking the passage of time with their ancient rhythms, indifferent to the human dramas playing out beneath them. In a few hours, the sun would rise on another day of uncertainty and change, but for now, Samuel Morrison allowed himself to hope that somewhere in the darkness, an Apache girl was also looking at those same stars and remembering that she was not alone in the world.